In the early 1980s, the Sunset Strip was a breeding ground for rebellious rock acts, but none were as audacious as W.A.S.P. Led by Blackie Lawless, the band fused heavy metal aggression with theatrical shock rock, culminating in their explosive 1984 self-titled debut. By 1982, the lineup solidified with Chris Holmes and Randy Piper on guitars, Tony Richards on drums, and Lawless on vocals and bass. Lawless later reflected, "We played the Troubadour, working our way up from a Tuesday night to a Wednesday night to a Thursday night to a Friday, and then Friday and Saturday nights, all in a 4-month period. Every show, the crowds got bigger and bigger. Many nights, the shows were oversold beyond capacity. From there, we moved on to bigger venues and then theaters, and less than 11 months from the time we played our first show, we played the Santa Monica Civic Arena. The local music magazine was The Music Connection, and every week they published a list of the top ticket-selling groups in Los Angeles. Eventually, we became the #1 band. We had no money, but we looked like we had millions. All this with no manager and no record company. We were now too big for them to refuse to pay attention to us." During a Full and Bloom interview with Tony Richards, the drummer talked about the group's early days.
At first it was fun. I'd make it down from Long Beach up to Hollywood, and Randy was in between us. I forget where his studio was, but I'd make it over there in about the same amount of time for Blackie. We'd all make it over to Randy's, and we'd hang out in there, and he'd block time out on other bands, and it'd just be us. And we'd rehearse and write and spend hours in there, and it was pretty fun. And we'd go get something to eat, or go shoot pool, or drive up to Hollywood after that, and just hang out. Pretty much those were good times, when we were just getting to know each other and writing, and it was kind of exciting.
The early W.A.S.P. shows in Los Angeles became legendary for their visceral shock rock theatrics. Performances featured Lawless hurling raw meat into crowds, mock crucifixions, and semi-naked models strapped to torture racks. On developing the live show, Lawless said, "One of the crew that worked for us had a workshop that his father owned, and it was a complete metal and woodworking shop. We spent months there, day after day, night after night, working on whatever ideas we could dream up. The first thing we built there was the torture rack that we used with the half-naked girl. After the rack was finished, the next thing we started on was the W.A.S.P. flaming sign. This thing was a monster in its own way, not only the way it looked when it was finished, but equally what we had to do to build it." During a Full and Bloom interview with Chris Holmes, the guitarist talked about building the sign.
"It's a sign made out of wood, W.A.S.P, and then the out and around W.A.S.P, like a frame, is just a pipe. You'll make it at the hardware store. We all sat and built those over at Kurt Steitz's dad's shop, all the stuff. I remember when we hooked up this sign to blow the flames, they hooked them up with the barbecue regulators, and the flames came out about 2 inches, right? Because we drilled a 1-inch ID pipe, every inch in it all the way around. And I was like, man, we got to get a coupling to take these regulators off and blow pure gas through, and it'll kick ass. Once we did that, boy, it was good. The flames came out about 2 feet.
The thing that was pretty scary was when he'd reach back with that torch and he'd ignite that big sign that was right over my head. You talk about sunburn and feeling heat right away. I don't know. I was crazy back then, so I didn't let it bother me that much. I knew how badass it looked, so I went right along with it. I was as crazy as anyone else out there, so it looked good, and it even got me going. It's got my blood boiling.
I do have to pay credit and homage. There's a guy named Kurt Steitz, another guy named Kurt Levis, and Ron Jack, who from 1982 to 1984, they're the ones that had the shop. One guy's dad owned a shop in Pasadena that we made all the W.A.S.P. props. If it wasn't for those guys, W.A.S.P. would not be where it is today. They built the sign, the meat boxes, all the pyrotechnics. They built the torture rack, everything, the drum riser, everything. Russell Wallace, he worked with W.A.S.P. for a while. They're all people that I went to school with because I was born there. I got a lot of friends. Tony, he didn't have too many friends. Randy didn't have too many friends, and Blackie didn't. I'm the guy that everybody, their whole road crew was, where all the equipment would go after the shows and stuff like that. And what's really sad is they were all offered jobs once we got a record deal, right? To go on the road, and then all of a sudden when we got a record deal, Blackie's like, we got to hire professionals now. It kind of hurt me, but those guys are still my friends even today.
We're not doing things that are tremendously that much different. We're just taking an old tried and true package and we're wrapping it up a little bit differently. The presentation, the way we do it, is a type of theater called psychodrama, which I've since been told is psychotic people doing drama.
The first shows were just absolutely awesome. They were unbeatable. There was nobody else in town that could touch us. We were just madmen.
One night we were playing the Troubadour, and Blackie took the meat box at the end of the show. We had already done the last song, right, of the night, and we were banging out the notes and waiting for Tony to hit the last, boom, and we're done. And Blackie throws this meat box through the sign that was burning at the end. We'd light it at the beginning and have just the flames going with no lights on it. And it's really cool playing just flames. And then at the end, we did it. At the very last end, and Blackie was doing the Blackie Lawless, whatever, his little character. And he threw the meat box that had the meat in it. He threw that through the sign. It bounced against the black wall and happened to hit me right in the temple on the head.
Oh,
knocked
shit.
me out cold. The roadies had to carry me up the stairs. They couldn't even bring me to. I just remember waking up in the dressing room and they go, "Chris, you all right?"
During a Full in Bloom interview with Randy Piper, the guitarist said,
"We're just basically playing our asses off. We're playing the Troubadour maybe every 2 weeks. The whiskey. We were constantly playing and constantly recording even then until we did get signed with Rod Smallwood."
Our Halloween show in '83 was actually the night before, on the 30th of October. The show was great, and the Troubadour was a madhouse as usual. Kerrang! Magazine had sent one of their primary photographers to shoot the show. We had been making a big noise for a while in L.A., and Kerrang! Had already featured us prominently in some earlier issues. So Ross Halfin was there shooting the show, but he wasn't by himself. He brought a friend. The next night was Halloween, and I went to the Rainbow to try to numb my anxieties. Halloween at the Rainbow was always crazier than it was even on a regular night. So I'm walking through the restaurant trying to get to my table, and an arm reaches out and grabs me. I look down, and there's this guy sitting there with a Viking helmet on his head, complete with horns on it. He pulls me down to the seat next to him and immediately starts telling me what I'm doing wrong with the band and how the presentation won't work outside of Los Angeles. After about 3 minutes of me listening without me saying a word, he finishes his opening statement, and I say to him, "Who the hell are you? I've never met this man in my life." And he's going on like his opinion really matters. I didn't know who he was, and frankly, I was offended by him, so I got up and proceeded on to my table. I didn't think much more about it that night. So the next night, I go back down to the Rainbow again. I'm walking along, an arm grabs me again and pulls me down. Guess who? Yep, same guy, but this time no Viking helmet. He starts in again on me with the same speech as the night before. "You're doing it all wrong." This time I took real offense. The band had accomplished some pretty remarkable stuff up to that point, so we had to be doing at least something right. We had no help, no label, and no manager, and had become the #1 band in Los Angeles. So I'm not really liking what this guy is throwing at me, and I started to get up and leave, and a girl that was standing there who could see I wasn't too happy with this line of questioning leaned over and said to me, "He's the manager of Iron Maiden." I had heard of Maiden, but they weren't yet near as big in the U.S. as they would later become. Randy had heard some of their songs and was getting into it, but I didn't know much about them. So I say, "Who are you?" He says, "I'm Rod Smallwood. I manage Iron Maiden." He had gone with Ross Halfin, against his will, to the Troubadour for the Halloween show. Rod said later he had seen pictures of us and thought we were some sort of a joke and couldn't be taken seriously, but Ross insisted he go. Rod's a huge Doors fan, and in those days, we used their song "The End" as the opening to the show. He said, "Well, maybe this won't be so bad after all." By the time the show was over, he was becoming a believer. So we keep talking, and it's starting to get a little heated because I really don't want to hear what this guy's got to say anymore. I wasn't much impressed with him being the manager of Maiden. I started to leave again, and in a much calmer, more sincere voice, he says, "Listen to me, you've got something with your band that has the chance to be big, but you can't do it by yourself." We spent a lot of time together the next few days. He had to go back to England 4 or 5 days later, and by the time he left, I instinctively felt I had found the one thing I'd been looking for my whole life, a true partner.
Once the business end came into it, it was rush, rush, rush. Hurry here, hurry there, sign this, sign that. You got to be there yesterday, So things really started rolling along really fast after that.
Rod came back out to Los Angeles a couple of weeks later, and we started laying out a plan. First, we needed a record deal. He initially went to EMI Capital because that was Iron Maiden's label. They were more interested now because they felt, with Rod as manager, they might have something, but still they were not willing to commit. There was a smaller local label called Enigma Records that believed in us and wanted to sign us months before. The owner of the company offered to mortgage his house to sign us. Actually, we came very close to accepting his offer. So while EMI were dragging their feet, we made it known that Enigma wanted us pretty badly. A couple of weeks later, EMI finally said I do, and we signed the largest deal in history for any previously unsigned band. We had won the lottery overnight.
We probably got one of the biggest deals that any unsigned band had gotten at that time, and everybody had gotten signed. In L.A., we were the last ones with, Motley Crue and Brad Dawkins and Black and Blue, and all of us, pretty much got signed at the same time. And we got one of the biggest deals, which was, our deal was like a 2+4 option. So it was 2 guaranteed, and actually the deal was for $3 million. I remember me and Tony got new cars, man. We're driving down the freeway, slamming beers, looking at each other with our feet hanging out the window and shit. I mean, it couldn't have got any better than that, you know what I mean?
I didn't get a car because I had a suspended license. By that time, I was on my 5th DUI. So when we got a record deal, I didn't really get anything. Tony and Randy got cars. I didn't really need anything. I wanted to do a record and go on the road, and I wanted to actually have a gold record to my name, So that was my dream at the time, have a gold record. So, but I was put on $120 a week.
I think the records are entities in themselves, and at the end of the day, the tunes are what matters. If you don't have songs, you don't have anything. Yeah. There's an old expression in Hollywood says you can't hype a bad product. That's not true. You can hype a bad product. You just can't hype it very long. And at the end of the day, if it's not on those grooves, you have nothing.
The day we signed the deal with EMI, we went down to the Capitol Records building, and they took us to the conference room. Inside was a long table with chairs around it, and all the bosses were there. We sat down, and in the middle of the table was a freshly cut cow tongue. It was huge, and it smelled nasty, just sitting there in the middle with blood running down the table, dripping off the edge. Nobody said a word about it. They were all acting like everything was normal, like nothing unusual was happening. After about 10 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore, and I jumped up and screamed, "Get that damn thing out of here!" The whole room exploded with laughter. It was EMI's way of saying, welcome.
Remember, it was tons of paperwork. I remember going to the top of Capitol to sign the papers and shit, which was pretty cool. Capitol building, and we were going to do a video on the roof one time, but I don't think they'd let us for insurance purposes.
We signed a record deal, and before we found Mike Barney, we couldn't put Fuck Like a Beast on the record because the Capitol wasn't going to let it be on the record, even if they call it Animal. So that was done at an independent label in Europe. That was recorded at Cherokee. Animal was recorded there with the B-side of it. And that was done for Music for Nations. That's the name of the record company.
First single, we were going to release the first single, and Capitol said no. So then I guess they got us a deal on Restless Records overseas or whatever. They were going to print it in London or something. And then the Queen's Council got a hold of it and said, you can't do it here either. They ended up pressing it in Belgium, I think, and importing it into England. And once it got to England, it was on the charts for like 110 weeks or something like that, which was like a record at that time.
I mean, I've had people call me the devil. I understand there's some guy out here that's going to start a petition around here as one of the local clergy or something like that. He's calling me the devil. Well, if I'm the devil, you ought to be glad because I'm keeping him in business.
The label called and said EMI in London got a letter from the Queen's Council, which would be the equivalent of our Congress here. The letter said if they released Animal, they were going to jail for 28 days each. An odd thing happened. They stepped aside and let Music for Nations release the song as a single. I don't know if there's ever been a case where once a group or an artist was signed to a major label, that label stepped aside and let someone else come in and release a record they had the rights to.
Somebody was asking me the other day how I got the idea for the song Animal. I said I hooked up a videotape in my bedroom, rolled it back, made it rhyme.
I mean, we did Animal in one day.
The whole song from start to finish was recorded in one day?
One day. Laid the drums up, went down, did the guitars.
And he even did his vocals in one day?
Yeah.
This guy got knocked out in Finland one night, I mean, we were doing the show up there, and we did this song called Animal, which you've probably heard of. And I go, how many of you eat like a beast? And the whole crowd goes, well, I says, well, if you eat like a beast, then you must be an animal. When I say the word animal, he's supposed to start the song, right? Well, when I say, then you must be an animal, the crowd roar goes up and I hear no music. And I look over, and there he is, out cold on the floor. Somebody brought a rump roast. They were bringing their own meat to the show. And they took and hit him with a right square in the forehead. And he's just laid out on this edge. I'm going, oh, God, I'm in hell, right? What am I going to do? The roadie's got him up under his shoulders and slapping his face and reviving him. So,
the crowd must have loved it.
Well, they don't think it's part of the show.
I remember the excitement of that song, being in a nice environment, being in that studio, and other people coming in and out in the studios next door and stuff. And I think Quiet Riot was in there recording. I just remember going sort of like from, I wouldn't say rags to riches, but just, just having the respect and being in there and working and, putting something together that was very exciting. And for me, it was just being really excited about the whole thing. It was neat to be there and be included.